I know you all want to talk, but we've got some great speakers here this morning, and it'll be many of your first chance to meet actually these candidates for governor and get the measure. I'm honored again to be introducing Milwaukee County Executive Scott Walker, Republican candidate for governor. Scott was born November 2nd, 1967, to Lou and Pat Walker in Colorado Springs, Colorado. His earliest years were spent in Plainfield, Iowa, where his father served as pastor of a local church. I believe, I don't have this written down, but I believe he also then moved to Delafield for the same, or Delavan rather, where his father was also called to pastor. In 1986, Scott moved to Milwaukee to attend Marquette University. While still in school, he worked for IBM, leaving to work full-time in financial development for the American Red Cross. Scott was elected to the State Assembly in 1993. There he chaired several committees and authored important pieces of legislation that include truth in sentencing, photo ID requirements to vote, and the elimination of the statute limitations on sexual assault cases. He was reelected 4 times. While serving in the legislature, he was a consistent supporter of small business and the Wisconsin Restaurant Association. In 2002, Scott was elected Milwaukee County Executive to reform the scandal-ridden county government. His election followed a recall campaign against the then Milwaukee County Executive Tom Ament as a result of a county pension scandal. The media exposed a county plan that gave away millions in retirement benefits to county workers. The scandal rocked county government to its core and left taxpayers on the hook for millions in pension obligations. The recall of Ament and the election of Scott Walker was truly an astounding, grassroots-driven occurrence. It actually harkens, I think, a little bit to the Tea Party movement sweeping the country today. For a Republican to be elected Milwaukee County Executive was every bit the tsunami for Milwaukee and Wisconsin as the recent election in Massachusetts was for the state and the nation. For the next 7 years, Scott faithfully kept his promise to spend taxpayer money as if it were his own. He cut the county's debt by 10%, reduced the county workforce by more than 20%, and authored 7 consecutive budgets without increasing the property tax in the previous year. And despite failing national and state economies, Milwaukee County recorded a budget surplus in 2008. He was reelected in April of 2008, and Scott received 60% of the vote in a county that favored President Obama by 67%. Scott and his wife Tonette live in Wauwatosa with their sons Matt and Alex. They are active in their community and their church. The Wisconsin Restaurant Association is honored to welcome Scott Walker to speak to us today.
Thank you. Should look at my watch. I can still say good morning for the next 7 or 8 minutes. It is good to be with you. Ed, after that introduction, I should say, based on Massachusetts, I should introduce myself as I'm Scott Walker. I'm from Wauwatosa. I ride a Harley, and I want to be your next governor. It is good to be back with the Wisconsin Restaurant Association. For years, when I served in the legislature, had the good fortune of working with Ed, and is a great representative for not only this organization, but for just the kind of caliber of people you want working, representing the interest of small and mid-sized businesses across the state, particularly in the restaurant and hospitality field. And it's been a real honor working with him over the years, so thank you, Ed, for that introduction. It's interesting. I have been crisscrossing the state. In fact, I've been at a number of your establishments. Just this last weekend, I traveled from Wauwatosa, my home, to Stevens Point, to Anago, to Merrill, to Tomahawk, to Woodruff, to Minocqua, to St. Germain, to Eagle River, back to Rhinelander, up to Hurley, over to Ashley, down to Phillips, along the way in Medford, then went to the Dells, and then went back home Sunday night to catch the last 5 minutes of the Super Bowl on TV. That's a slow weekend for us. But it's important to get around the state, particularly in parts of the state that are outside of Madison and Milwaukee, because I think it's important for people to understand that those running to be the leader of this state government, understand the needs and desires of people all across the state of Wisconsin. In my case, it's interesting, too, because one of the things I do often is not just go to speak at events, but many times, particularly at the mornings and at lunch, I'll go stop at some of your establishments, some of the WRA members from across the state. I know the other day I was in Anago at the Refuge. I was one day in Rhinelander at Wolf's log cabin restaurant. I was up at the South Shore Brewery in Ashland, and on the way home on Sunday, right before I headed out from the Dells, or just after I headed out from the Dells, I should say, I stopped just north of town at the exit for Dane to stop and grab a burger at Culver's. So we've been all over the state of Wisconsin, and that's important because my family comes from a long history, at least starting out. I started out my first job living in Walworth County in Delavan, where I grew up, working the first job ever as a dishwasher at the Countryside Restaurant, which is right on the county line between Walworth and Rock County on your way over to Janesville. I then in high school stepped it up a little bit and started to flip burgers at McDonald's. My wife Tonette was a waitress for many years at Sally's coming out of school, and carrying on that tradition, my son Matthew, we've got two sons, but Matthew, my sophomore, serves pizza at a restaurant down in the village in Wauwatosa. So we know that if you want to reach people, one of the best places to go is to the restaurants in any given community. So as I've been traveling the state for the last several months, but particularly just this last weekend, we've gone from restaurant to restaurant, from location to location. And what I found is that even though my schedule is somewhat tiresome, I get strength really from talking to the people of the state. I believe without a doubt the people of this state are our greatest asset. But I'm here to tell you today, as many of you know, the people of our state are scared. They're scared about the economy, scared about their jobs, whether it's their job, whether it's their spouse's job, their kid's job, their neighbor's job, their employee's job. They're scared. What I've been trying to tell people is you don't have to be scared because help is on the way. Come this November, we're going to take this government back and put government back in the hands of the people, not the powerful special interests, not the people out of touch with reality of what you're doing in your communities with the people who work for you, but put it firmly back in the hands of the people of the state of Wisconsin. And the reason I can say that with absolute certainty goes to the introduction that Ed given, and that was 8 years ago, almost to the day. 8 years ago, I was commuting back and forth along I-94 from my home in Wauwatosa. I'd pick up a couple guys in our carpool, and we'd go over to the state capitol as members of the state assembly at that time. And I remember back at that time, one morning, I was listening to the radio as I was driving along, and this scandal about the pension was coming out day by day. More and more was coming out, and I remember that particular morning, the guy on the radio said, Scott Walker should run for county executive. And after I pulled the car back into the road, the guys in my carpool said, what do you think about that? I said, absolutely not. No way, no how. The people are angry. So the last place an elected official wants to be is amongst a bunch of angry voters. I said, I was angry. My wife was angry. My in-laws were angry. My parents were angry. Everybody I knew was angry about what was happening the more we learned about this big pension debacle and scandal. And so I just kind of set that aside, and a little bit later that day, one of the guys in the carpool came into my office, and he said, I've been thinking about this. He said, you're in the news a lot. You're pushing big ideas. People know you. If you run, people could think you could win. I said, that's even worse. I said, not only is there a pension, there was a big structural deficit. There were budget problems. There were all sorts of issues out there, just completely out of whack. In fact, for a while, the county executive, before I took office, actually made more money than the governor of the state of Wisconsin. That just shows you how completely out of whack things were in our county government. And so I just kind of set it aside, and a week or so went by, and I was watching what was happening. And back at that time, if you didn't follow it, what was interesting is they were recalling the guy. They had a recall election for the guy at the job before me. And they were told they had to collect 73,000 signatures in 60 days. That sounds pretty insurmountable. You know what they did? In less than 30 days, the people, not a campaign, not a party, but everyday people, collected more than 157,000 signatures in less than 30 days. It was at that moment that I changed my perspective and realized I had been looking at things all wrong, because if it had just been about anger, people would have left. They would have checked out. They would have moved out. They would have thrown up their hands and given up. But instead, not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands of ordinary people did an extraordinary thing. They stood up and said, I want my government back. They didn't care what others told them. They didn't care what the odds were. They said, I want my government back. And I realized at that time, if enough of my neighbors, enough of my friends, enough of my own family were willing to stand up shoulder and shoulder to take their government back, they needed a leader who was willing to stand with them, not stand out and look at them. And at that time, I realized the real emotion on display wasn't anger. It was hope. Real hope. Not blind hope, not the kind of hope you see on a slogan, but hope that actually standing up together, they could take their government back. The great news was not only did we stand up with them and get elected, but after all the pundits said, well, boy, when they figure out this guy's a Republican, they'll never re-elect him. We got re-elected 2 years later, and 4 years after that, re-elected again. Now, I think the reason we did was, as extraordinary as it was to win in the first place, probably even more extraordinary in politics, we actually did what we said we were going to do. You know, we've cut our debt. We reduced the size of our workforce. We improved our bond rating, even while the state's bond rating was going down. We've done now 8 consecutive budgets that we presented to our county board that actually lowered or kept the tax levy the same as it was from the year prior. And last year, when the state had its largest budget deficit ever, we actually had a slight surplus. Now, we've also done all that, not just managing our budget, but last October we were awarded nationally the best park system in the country, the gold medal for that. Along the way, when you see airports here in Madison and others seeing dramatic drops in passengers, in fact, on a national average, there's been about a 6% drop in passengers. We actually had our best December ever at Mitchell International Airport, run by the county. One of the things I'm the most proud of is the fact that years ago there used to be thousands upon thousands of older adults on waiting lists for long-term care in Milwaukee County. And since we started family care and enacted it under our administration, there's not one older adult in our community who's on a waiting list for long-term care because of our partnership with the state through family care. We have shown you can not only balance the budget, you can do it in a way that funds your priorities and still keep your budget balanced without overtaxing the taxpayers. I know that if we can take on the political machine in Milwaukee and win not once, not twice, but 3 times and actually govern the way the rest of us think in the state of Wisconsin, there is no doubt we can take on the political machine up the street in the state's capital and win for all of you, the taxpayers of the state of Wisconsin. I have no doubt about it. In fact, our campaign is based on some very simple principles. Economic opportunity and prosperity for everyone, everyone. No matter where you're from, no matter what your background, no matter what part of the state you're from, economic opportunity and prosperity for everyone. And I think the way the next governor helps you get there is through limited government, lower taxes, fiscal responsibility, and increasingly these days, not only here but in our nation's capital, a restoration of our personal rights and liberties, because Lord knows they're under attack. We need to reclaim those. We need leaders who are going to stand up with the people, not against the people, and say enough is enough. It's time to get government out of the way so the private sector can actually move this state forward. That's probably the biggest difference you're going to get. You just heard from Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett. He's a good guy. We work together on things. But there's a fundamental difference in this race. If you believe over the last 8 years that Jim Doyle has taken this state and put it in a situation where we have a better business climate than we had before, then you should elect Tom Barrett as your next governor. Because you're going to get 4 more years of the same thing. Just maybe a nicer guy, but you're going to get 4 more years of Jim Doyle if you elect Tom Barrett. There's not one issue, not one policy, not one person in the administration that's going to be fundamentally different than what we've had over the past 8 years. But if, like me, you believe that this state, that this state government is headed in the wrong direction, then the only choice to take it 180 degrees from where we are at now and put it in the right direction, a direction that sides with the people and employers of the state, is to support our campaign. That's why I'm here today, to ask for your vote, to ask for your support, to ask for your enthusiastic support, because that's the only way we're going to take this state forward. When I look at the issues before us, I know that we can turn this state around. I believe in the state of Wisconsin. I believe in our people and our employers, but we need to have fundamental change, and I'll give you a few specific examples. When it comes to taxes, I think we need to lower the cost of doing business, and one of the best ways to do that is lower the tax burden. Last year we saw with this governor and this legislature too many tax increases. And they keep coming. They keep talking about things, not only raising the top income tax bracket, which they think only affects individuals, and as many of you know, when they raised it to 7 3/4, they affected a whole lot of small businesses like yours across the state of Wisconsin. That's got to change. When they change capital gains deductions, that affects the ability to invest in your businesses and others like yours across this state. When they start talking about raising the beer tax or the liquor tax or adding on taxes on soda or more taxes on cigarettes, those are all things that affect your livelihood and your businesses here. We need to lower the overall tax burden here. And one of those in particular I'd like to highlight on in your next governor. It may not seem directly apparent to those who have restaurants, but I think it does directly affect you. And that is we need to phase out the state tax on retirement income here in Wisconsin. I am convinced going around this state there is only one word that keeps any retiree or near retiree in the state of Wisconsin, at least anyone that's got an accountant, and that one word is grandchildren. So you don't have a grandchild in this state, there's no reason from a taxing point of view to stay in the state of Wisconsin. So instead, we have people whose hearts are here, their tradition is here, their family's here, but they're not only in Arizona and in Florida, they're in places like Texas and Tennessee and others where they have even Illinois. Illinois got a better tax climate than we do when it comes to retirement income. That's money that could be invested in businesses and startups and expansions, but when it comes to restaurants, those are people who are now going out to eat down in Sedona and Naples and not here, in Rhinelander or Medford or La Crosse or Wauwatosa or anywhere else across the state. We need to bring those people and their money and their resources back to the state of Wisconsin. Another area is regulation. I look at the regulations. I think overall I hear repeatedly from small and mid-sized business owners that state government has run amok, that there's just too much unpredictability in terms of where taking out permits are, where regulations are. They're only going to make it worse when you consider the things that are coming up in the Capitol today. And Ed and I were talking about this before. I know a lot of people were rushing up to the Capitol last year because of the state budget. You can't back down because they're still talking about things like wage lien, which would have a dramatically negative impact on business and the ability to access capital in the state. They're still talking about raising the minimum wage and indexing, which we all know would affect people like my son, who got his first job, who's low on the list because he's the last guy on, who would lose his first-time job coming in because he's the guy that gets put out the door when all of you have to raise your minimum wage. It's not about raising everybody else out. It's about losing jobs in the state if they start indexing or dramatically raising the minimum wage in this state. It's about so many other regulations out there, whether it's even mandating things like what you have to put on your menus and how you have to disclose that. In my mind, my view is you respond to your customers. That's the best way you're held accountable. Is your customers tell you what they want and how they want it, and that's how you make a profit. That's how you should be. Government should be out of your lives. Other than guaranteeing public safety and public health, government should have a very limited role, if any at all. So when it comes to regulation, I'm right out there and saying we need to ease the regulatory burden. I think we need to ease the litigation burden in the state. Thank God we held off on joint and several liability. Had we gone forward with the governor's proposal to go down to 1%, I don't know any of us who have any sort of business in the state who'd still be here if we went down to that low a level in joint and several liability. We need to make sure that doesn't happen, and we need to move forward making sure that we don't make it easier in this state to bring out even more frivolous, even more nuisance lawsuits. We need to make sure that, again, you all can do what you want to do, which is serve your customers. Serve the people that come in to eat and enjoy and have a good time at your establishments, not worry about the excess of out-of-control lawsuits in this state. The states that have seen incredible job growth in the last several years are states that have lowered or eliminated their tax burden and states that have eased up and put in place major tort reform to ease their litigation burden. We need to be a state like that so we can start adding, not just protecting jobs here in the state of Wisconsin. You look at, there's so many other areas that we could discuss, and I'll just rattle through a couple others. When it comes to health care, you talk about litigation, we need to make sure we help protect medical professionals as well, so they're not overly involved in preventative medicine, but instead actually doing the medicine that's necessary, not doing excess tests to try and avoid the kind of litigation problems they have in other states. Beyond that, we need to lift the state tax on health savings accounts. We need to have a partnership with the government, not a taking over of health care by the government like we've heard in Washington and like we've heard in the past through so-called Healthy Wisconsin, which is anything but. We need to make sure that government is a partner in making sure that there's transparency and disclosure for the true cost of medical procedures so that when you're buying health care options for your employees, you have the ability to know what you're getting, but we can't have a system that mandates things. That'll just kill small business, but particularly restaurants and other similar establishments here in the state of Wisconsin. And we need to make sure we've got a strong, vibrant education system in this state that prepares the workforce for the next generation of your employees, for the next generation of other employees across the state. We need a strong and vibrant public education as well as private education in this state. Those are just some of the specifics. And in a minute, I know Pete's collecting some questions. We're going to take some from the floor that he's collected. But I just want to tell you this in conclusion before we take questions. I want to make it perfectly clear, as troubled as I am about the direction of state government, as troubled as I am about the fact that over the last year we've lost 163,000 jobs in the state. I just find that completely unacceptable. And when I hear stories like the woman I met up in Rhinelander at a restaurant there who was there with her father who was celebrating his 80th birthday, and she told me about being a small business person. She owned a logging company there, and how frightened she was that she didn't think that she was going to be able to make payroll 6 or 7 months from now because of the way that the climate of the state's economy is going. Or hear about the couple up in Rhinelander this weekend I talked to who had a company of 5 themselves and 3 others, and who unfortunately had to lay those 3 off, and they felt horrible. Even though they weren't family, they felt like they were laying off family, and they had to sell their building and go into their garage to do the metal fabrication they did, but they were at least grateful that they had some work left, but they were just so afraid of the future. I know that times are rough in this state and across this country, but I also know that I have an incredible belief in the people and employers of this state. I believe in Wisconsin. Our employers, as I travel, or excuse me, our employees, the people of the state, I found from one end of the state, are incredible. They're hardworking, dedicated, well-educated workforce. You know them. They're the kind of people that embody the Midwestern work ethic, the kind of people you not only want to build a business around, but a community and a state around. I believe in our employers. All of you here and others like you across the state many times are 2 or 3 or 4 generations deep of family-owned businesses. For those that aren't, you treat your employees like family. You want to be here. You're begging the government to get out of the way so that you can add more jobs, put more people to work. You want to be vested and grow in your community, but you know that government's standing in the way. I believe in what we have to offer in the state. No other state in the union has the kind of natural resources that we have here in Wisconsin. We're surrounded by 2 Great Lakes and the greatest river in the country. We're filled with 15,000 inland lakes. That's 5,000 more than Minnesota. Eat your heart out, Brett Favre. Having grown up here, having started a family here, living here, playing here, working here, someday hoping to retire, I know there is no place in the world better than Wisconsin. What I found traveling the state, however, is what is failing us is not our people or our places. What is failing us is our government. And the good news is, come November 2nd of 2010, we the people, can take that government back. We can not only think back about how great the state once was in the 80s and 90s, we can dream even bigger about how much greater it will be again in the future. Thank you for the chance to share. Thank you for the opportunity to work with us. And I look forward, if God willing, I have the honor of serving and being elected and then serving as your next governor. I look forward to meeting with you not only at sessions like this, but in each of your communities. I know Ed and his team has done a great job in the past. Believe me, this is not the last time you're going to see me on the campaign trail, and it's definitely not the last you're going to see and hear from me if I have the honor of serving as your next governor. With that, Pete, I know you've got some questions. We'd be more than happy to take them.
I do have some questions, Mr. County Executive, and here comes another one. I have a lot of questions from folks, at least 4 or 5, that relate to getting business into this state and jobs. So I'm going to make this a 2-part question to kind of fold them all into it. What do you propose as a plan to make Wisconsin a more business-friendly state? And how do you think that relates to getting jobs into this state that are like the jobs that went away from GM? Is that possible? Can we get more jobs like that?
Yeah, 2 different parts in it. I have a simple goal, and that is I'd like to see in the next 2 years, through the policies we'd like to enact starting next January, if I have the honor of serving as governor, I have a goal of adding 4 to 5% to the payroll statewide of all the employers, big, small, and everything in between in this state. If we were able to get back up to about a 5% increase in payroll for our current employers in the state of Wisconsin, not necessarily bringing others in, although we'll take those as well, we could restore every one of the jobs lost in the recession since December of 2007. Now, I'll take a big company, I'll take the 1,000 or 500, but I know the vast majority of those jobs aren't going to come 500 or 1,000 at a time. They're going to come 5 or 10 or 15 jobs at a time, and they're going to come from businesses like yours. It's just a simple fact. And we can spend all the time we want in the world seeking for that one giant prize from outside of the state. And again, I won't turn it down if it's out there. But in the end, we need to spend the majority of our time focused on the employers here in the state of Wisconsin. When I worked at IBM to pay for school when I went to Marquette, I sold warranty agreements, and they taught us spend 75% of your time working with your current customer base because they were the most likely to buy more of your product. Spend about a quarter reaching out to new ones, potential clients, but spend 3/4 of your time with your existing client base. I think the same thing is true here in Wisconsin. We need to have a leader in this state who's going to spend the majority of his time as the governor in our administration's time, not just in Commerce, but in every other part of state government, saying what can we do to make it easier for you to not only maintain, but to create more jobs from the employers that we have currently in the state. The things I would do are similar, and I'll rattle through them, just outline bullet in a second by second from what I mentioned, but it's really all the things I just talked about. Lowering the cost of doing business. All the other things I just mentioned, there are plenty of good reasons to do business in Wisconsin. A great workforce, great employers and suppliers, others to work with, great chambers and economic development commissions. There are tremendous natural resources and an outstanding quality of life. There's plenty of great reasons to be here and to grow here in Wisconsin. The biggest barriers I hear to those who want to add more jobs in the state are the things that are imposed largely by government. Too high a tax burden, too high a regulatory burden, too high a legal burden. And then the things that I hear most about aside from that are the high cost of health care. Not the health care debate we hear in Washington about access to health care, but rather the cost to mid and small-sized employers. And if we can find ways to address that, not through the heavy hand of the government, but through government being a partner to allow you to access larger purchasing pools, to minimize your shared risk, to allow you to know the true cost of health care, to tap into health savings accounts without a state sales or state income tax on those. Those are the sorts of things that I think open the door to true economic opportunity. Others can talk all they want about jobs, 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 and they can tell you they got every plan and program in the world. But we've seen in the last year in Washington what happens when you put $1 trillion with interest into a jobs program that's driven by the government. It doesn't work. The only true way to make things work, in my mind, is to put more money back in the hands of the people and employers of this state. It worked almost 30 years ago nationally. You know, when Ronald Reagan's tax cuts were fully enacted in 1983, from 83 through the end of the decade, we had the largest sustainable peacetime economic growth in American history. 21 million new jobs were created, 5 million new businesses were created during that time frame because they slashed the marginal tax rate and they put money back in the hands of the people. That's the clear contrast. If you want more of the same, if you want more of Governor Doyle, Tom Barrett and his allies have a plan that will take you down that path of more government, more spending, more taxes. I think the answer is putting your faith not in the government but in the people, and by doing so, ultimately I think we'll create more jobs and opportunity in this state. Not that I get worked up about that.
Well, let's stick with that topic for a second. You mentioned government and spending, and I have a question here that asks, why do you think it is that the state budget keeps going up and we keep spending more money? And is that something, and that's been under both Democratic and Republican administrations here in Madison. Do you have a solution for that?
Yes, spend less. I mean, that's the simple answer, although I think you have to have a dual track. I think it's a combination to reduce spending, which means changing the way that government itself is set up. I think it means targeting specific programs. I think it thinks weeding out the fraud and abuse in programs like Medicaid that's out there and improving and reforming that. It means going after things like Badger Care and the Wisconsin Share programs, both of which were supposed to be temporary safety nets as people came out of welfare and went into the private sector to get work, long-time employment, and instead, for many people, have become permanent entitlements, particularly on the child care side, where you see all the stories about abuse. Those are any number of programs that we need to reform to get back on track. One, to just make them work, and two, because it'll control government spending. I also think there needs to be a realistic wage and benefit reform when it comes to state and local government. All of you know how much different the benefits that you're able to provide your employees are from what those are received for by the public sector. Now, I'm not here to pick on public employees because there's many great public servants who work for state and local government. But there is a total disconnect between what public sector employees get and what everybody else who pays for those public sector and the private sector get, and that has to be balanced out if you're going to have long-term sustainable government in this state. If you don't, you're going down the path of GM and Chrysler. It's just like the legacy costs they inherit. So one side is true spending reform and reduction in state government. The other part, though, is I don't think you can do that alone. I don't think it's enough to just control spending. I think you at the same time have to have an aggressive pro-growth agenda. That means not only avoiding tax increases, I believe that means pursuing tax cuts and other things that make it easier to do business, to expand business, to attract business to the state. I think if you have an aggressive pro-growth agenda, even as it's lowering the tax burden, you actually see more revenues coming to the state treasury as more wealth and more employees are hired here in the state of Wisconsin.
We maybe have time for 2 more questions.
Sure.
I'll throw 2 more at you. You've probably seen news about legislation that's passed relating to drunk driving, cracking down on repeat offenders in certain ways. What's your feeling about legislation that passed, and do you think there's more that Wisconsin can do about drunk driving?
Well, I certainly think one of the biggest problems I've seen here and all across the state are multiple offenders. And to the degree that we can crack down, not only crack down in terms of punishment, but ultimately keep multiple offenders off of our streets, I mean, that's ultimately the paramount. It breaks my heart every time, and I saw it 17 years ago when there was a family near to us in Wauwatosa who lost their 6-year-old son from a guy who was a 9-time repeat offender. And I remember looking at that thinking, how is this guy even out on the street? It's a walking menace out there. And so I think to that degree, the more we can focus in on keeping multiple offenders off the street. And I think, quite frankly, for all the talk about the cost involved with that, one of the things that's been missing a little bit of the common sense from that equation is for offenders like that, you don't need to keep them in a high-priced prison facility. If you're cracking down on someone like that, you could actually have them in a rented apartment building as long as you can guarantee they're not out in a car driving intoxicated. That's what really you need to keep them protected from. The guy who's at the corner gas station with a sawed-off shotgun willing to hold the place up, that's a guy that belongs behind bars from a public safety standpoint because he's a physical menace. He's a public safety risk. These individuals are a public safety risk because they get intoxicated and then get in the cars and time again go out and create a menace. We need to keep them off the streets. So to the extent that we can do that, I think there are much more cost-effective ways than what the legislature and the governor have been talking about up until now.
Last question I have for you is one that we also asked Mayor Barrett when he was here, and that is to tell us if you believe that the high-speed rail line from Milwaukee to Dane County is the best way to spend the stimulus money.
Well, aside even from the federal use of the stimulus money, there's a couple key questions that I think have not been answered. First, what is the true cost? Because in rail projects all across the nation, they're oftentimes 2 to 3 times higher than the initial price. So as any of you know, if you're going to add on to your restaurant, you want to know from the contractor what's the real price up front before you start making a decision about that. Secondly, nobody has really talked in the media or anywhere else about what the cost is to operate and who's going to pay for that. I mean, again, you want to add another, it's great if you got a raffle at your place and the raffle is a new Maserati, but if you can't pay the insurance on putting that Maserati out in the street, it doesn't do any good if that car is sitting in your garage for the next 10 years. You can't use it. And that's another issue that hasn't been addressed. Who's going to pay and where's it going to come from to operate that? Because no rail line from a passenger standpoint can operate without a substantial subsidy for operations. And the third key component, which I think is the most important, is no one has addressed how much money is going to come out of the state transportation fund to pay for that. Why that's important, and it goes to the question that was asked earlier about the budget. The past 2 prior budgets, the governor rated $1.3 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars out of the state transportation fund. It's why just down the way from me by the Zoo Interchange in Milwaukee, 3 of those bridges are posted with weight limits so our motor carriers can't go around them, and they're now spending $22 million to build a couple of temporary bridges to let traffic go through until that's fixed in a few years. It's why when you go from one end of the state to the other, you see major potholes and other detriments in not only our state highway system, but in our county trunk roads, our town roads, our city streets, because they've rated $1.3 billion out of the transportation fund. I don't know how we talk about adding a major new component to transportation in this state that clearly is going to eat into the transportation fund when we haven't identified how we're going to take care of our current infrastructure. To me, again, that's one of those where it's great to add on to your restaurant, but if you got a big hole in your roof in your current restaurant, it doesn't do any good when all the rain comes rushing in. If you got a great addition, if it floods out your kitchen, you're still in trouble. And that's really the problem you got right here is we've got to make sure before we talk about anything that the state has identified a long-term way to maintain our current infrastructure, not only in transportation, but in energy and having a reliable power sources around the state as well, but in this case, particularly for transportation. So from my standpoint, until we answer those questions, I don't think the state should be adding anything at this time.
Milwaukee County Executive
Thanks
Scott
very much
Walker,
for your time.
everybody.